They said it was for the family. But how do you justify stealing from your own daughter's future? My parents took my federal grant, handed it to their golden boy, and called it love. I stayed quiet. I filed the report. And when the cops knocked 3 days later, their silence finally matched mine. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The morning air in Cambridge felt colder than usual, the kind of chill that seeps through old apartment windows, no matter how tightly they're sealed. My coffee machine clicked softly behind me, filling the small kitchen with the familiar smell of burnt beans and comfort. I sat at my desk by the window, the glow of my laptop casting a pale light across the room. Numbers filled the screen. Progress reports, expense sheets, grant allocation files. Routine, safe, predictable. Until they weren't. A small notification popped up at the corner of the screen. Transaction alert. 120,000 transferred to Thomas Grant. My hand froze on the mouse. I blinked once, twice, as if I had misread it. My heart gave a slow, heavy thud. Then another. I clicked the message open. There it was again, in black and white, 120,000 withdrawn from the Nova Bridge Project Fund, the same federal grant I'd been protecting for 2 years. The same money that wasn't just mine. It belonged to the students, to the program, to everything I'd built from nothing. For a moment I couldn't hear anything but the ticking of the wall clock. It was sharp, mechanical, like it was mocking me for trusting too easily. I opened the online banking dashboard, checked the recipient account. It wasn't a stranger. It was my father. My throat tightened. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he had mixed something up. I opened the audit log. Each transaction listed with names, timestamps, authorizations. The withdrawal had been approved by Grant, my mother. I leaned back slowly, the chair creaking beneath me. They knew exactly what they were doing. My fingers moved automatically, searching for the grant agreement, the federal guidelines I had memorized the first week I got the funding. Funds may not be used for personal gain or family-related purposes. A violation meant suspension, legal penalties, disqualification from future grants. Everything I had worked for, 10 years of night classes, rejected proposals, scraping for credibility, was suddenly in their hands. I felt heat rush to my face, but my body stayed still. The anger was there, buried under layers of disbelief. No, I whispered. They wouldn't. I grabbed my phone and called the bank. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Hi, this is Madeline Grant, account ending in 4729. I'm seeing an unauthorized transaction of $120,000. I need to freeze that account immediately. The customer service rep hesitated. Let me check. It says the transfer was authorized by a co-signer, Thomas Grant. He's listed as an account partner. Do you recognize that name? Yes, I said quietly. I do. The line went silent for a second. The woman's tone softened. I'm sorry, ma'am, but since he's listed as a co-owner, the transaction is valid. I can file a report, but the funds are already in the destination account. My hand trembled as I ended the call. I stood up, walking to the window. Outside, the sky hung heavy and gray over the old brick buildings of Cambridge. A gust of wind pushed against the glass, rattling the frame. I pressed my palm to the cold surface, trying to steady my breathing. I remembered the afternoon my mother convinced me to add my father's name to the account. It'll just make things easier, she'd said with that calm, reasonable tone that always made me doubt myself. If something happens while you're traveling, he can sign documents for you. Something did happen. I just hadn't expected it to be them. I went back to my desk and opened the email archives. A chain of correspondence from Future Mind Foundation blinked on the screen. Grant disbursement phase 3 approved. Please confirm all financial custodians remain unchanged. I had confirmed, of course, because nothing in me had ever believed my family could take what wasn't theirs. I opened the transfer record again, staring at the timestamp, 7:14 a.m. today. While I was asleep, they had logged in, used their credentials, and moved the money. I could almost see my mother's hands on the keyboard, calm and deliberate. She probably told herself it was for family. The word made my stomach twist. I picked up the phone again, this time scrolling through contacts until I reached the one labeled Mom. My thumb hovered over the call button, but I stopped. What would I even say? There was no version of that conversation where I didn't come out smaller, guilty for being angry. Instead, I closed my eyes and tried to think. The rational part of me began to take over the one that had built Nova Bridge from a rented office and a $5,000 seed grant. I would document everything, contact the grant provider, file a report, and handle it through the proper channels. I wasn't a scared kid anymore. I didn't need to beg for fairness. Still, a single question burned behind my ribs. Why? I looked down at the notification again, that sterile line of text glowing on the screen. $120,000 transferred to Thomas Grant. No explanation, no apology, just fact. They had my trust, my name, my access, and they used all three against me. Outside, a gust of wind howled down the narrow street, sending a trash can lid clattering across the pavement. The noise startled me, but I didn't move. I just stood there, staring out into the gray, my reflection faint in the glass. Tired eyes, clenched jaw, a woman who'd finally run out of excuses for the people who raised her. They had the right to sign, I whispered, but not the right to take. The coffee machine clicked off behind me, the last bit of steam curling into the air. I didn't touch it. My hands were still cold. I sat down again, staring at the empty balance on the screen. They hadn't just stolen money. They'd stolen the years I'd spent believing they were on my side. And for the first time, I understood exactly how fragile trust could be. The day I got the email from Future Mind Foundation, the world outside my apartment window looked like it had been washed clean. Boston was gray that morning, but my screen glowed with a single subject line that made everything else fade away. Congratulations. Grant approval notice. I opened it with shaking hands. $120,000. Federal Innovation Grant. Approved. My heart stopped for a beat before it found its rhythm again. I laughed out loud, the kind of laugh that comes from too many years of hearing not this time. Then I cried. It wasn't about the money. It was about what it meant. Someone finally believed in what I was building. I grabbed my phone and called my parents. Dad picked up first, his voice warm and familiar. Well, there's my superstar. What's the big news this time? I got it, I said, still breathless. The Future Mind Grant. They approved the entire proposal. There was a long pause before I heard him chuckle. I always knew you'd get there. Mom's voice came on speaker right after. See, I told you hard work pays off. Finally, you're doing something meaningful. We're proud of you, Maddie. Her words were supposed to make me happy, but something in her tone carried the faint surprise of someone who hadn't really expected it to happen. I chose to ignore it. That evening, I drove to Cambridge for dinner. The smell of beef stew greeted me at the door. The house felt the same. Old hardwood family photos, the faint scent of lilac air freshener my mother loved. Ethan was already at the table scrolling on his phone. He looked up when I walked in. Well, look at the lady of the hour, he said, grinning. How does it feel to be rich? Don't forget your little brother when you're throwing all that grant money around. I laughed, trying to keep things light. It's not that kind of money, Ethan. It's for research, not for me. He shrugged. Still counts. You're officially the breadwinner now. Mom set a bowl of stew in front of me and sat down across the table. We're just glad to see you doing something with all that education, she said, half smiling. For a while, I thought you'd stay buried in those spreadsheets forever. Dinner went smoothly, warm and full of noise. The clink of forks, the hum of conversation, the kind of family rhythm that made me forget how strained things sometimes were. I told them about Nova Bridge Learning, how it would help underfunded schools access digital learning tools, how the grant would cover outreach in rural areas. Dad nodded approvingly, though I could tell he didn't really understand the technical parts. Mom listened, her smile tight. It sounds complicated, she said. You've always been good with that sort of thing. Complicated in her language was a polite way of saying she didn't get it, and maybe didn't think it would last. But she still looked proud, or at least practiced at it. Later that night, while we were clearing dishes, she brought it up casually. Maddie, you'll need to manage that kind of money carefully. Maybe let your father help with the paperwork. He's dealt with accounts before. I hesitated. I already have an accountant mom. Everything's done through Future Mind's portal. She gave a soft laugh, the kind that sounded more like a sigh. Of course, but things happen. If you're traveling or something comes up, it might be smart to have your father listed as an alternate signatory. You know, just to make sure nothing gets stuck. Dad looked up from his chair. She's right. It's just precaution. You trust your old man, don't you? I smiled, then not wanting to sound defensive. Of course I do. That weekend I drove home again with a folder of forms. We sat in the living room under the yellow light of the old floor lamp while I showed them the paperwork. It's simple, I said. They just need both our signatures for the access list. He won't need to do anything else. Mom handed Dad a pen. It'll make things easier. You never know when you'll need help. He signed without hesitation. I followed, my hand steady, my heart full. At the time, it felt like an act of trust. Now, looking back, it feels more like handing someone the key to a vault and assuming they'd never open it. A year later, Nova Bridge was running strong. We had partners' classrooms across 3 states and small success stories piling up like trophies I didn't have time to polish. Every few weeks, Dad would ask how the project was going. Mom's questions were more pointed. "Do they pay you well?" she'd ask. "I hope you're saving something for yourself." Meanwhile, Ethan had landed a real estate deal and bought a new car. Mom couldn't stop talking about him. "He's got such good instincts for business," she told me once during dinner. "I always said he'd go far." I smiled politely and nodded, pretending it didn't sting. They were proud of me in their own way, but Ethan's success was easier to understand. Easier to brag about at church or the grocery store or the hair salon. He was the golden boy. I was the daughter who did something with computers. One night after another family dinner, Mom asked, "Do you ever wish you'd stayed closer? You could be home more, maybe even work from here. People trust local faces." "I can't really run an innovation program out of a living room," I said. She gave me that same look she always did when she thought I was being difficult. "You've always been so independent. Just remember, family is what lasts when everything else doesn't." I wanted to tell her that independence wasn't defiance, that I wasn't running from them, but towards something of my own. Instead, I just nodded. Some things weren't worth arguing about. Back in the present, sitting in my Cambridge apartment, I pulled open my file cabinet and slid out the original grant paperwork. The paper had yellowed slightly around the edges, but the ink was still sharp. My name, Madeline Grant, scrawled in careful blue ink, and right beside it, Thomas Grant. 2 signatures that once meant unity, now a reminder of how fragile trust can be. I traced my finger along the line between them, feeling the faint ridge where the pen had pressed too hard. That was the moment I'd handed them more than access. I'd given them control without realizing it. Back then, I thought adding his name was an act of love. Now it felt like the first betrayal I'd written myself into. It was one of those long New England afternoons where the air felt thick with sunlight. The curtains in my parents' living room filtered it into gold ribbons that danced across the mess of wedding invitations, tissue paper, and unopened boxes. Everywhere I looked, there were traces of celebration. Floral arrangements leaning against the wall, place cards spread across the coffee table, Jordan's voice spilling over everything like champagne bubbles. She sat beside my mother, her phone in hand, scrolling through images of centerpieces. I'm thinking peonies for the reception. She said, her tone bright and easy. White and blush, simple but elegant. "What do you think, Mrs. Grant?" Mom smiled indulgently. "Perfect. We'll make sure the florist adds something special. Ethan's wedding should feel like a storybook." Ethan stood near the window, looking proud and slightly bored, the way he always did when attention found him. I stepped inside quietly, holding a small wrapped box, a bottle of wine from Napa. Something understated. "Hey," I said. "Looks like things are coming together." Jordan turned, her smile polite and luminous. "Maddie, we were just talking about the ceremony. You're going to love it. Everything's almost ready," Mom added. "Ethan's handled most of it. You don't need to worry yourself with all these details." I handed her the gift. "It's not much, just something to celebrate." "Congratulations, both of you," Ethan grinned. "Thanks, big sis. You've been busy saving the world with your project, huh?" I laughed softly. "Something like that." Jordan leaned forward slightly, her eyes warm but detached. "It means a lot that you came by. Family support makes all the difference, doesn't it?" Mom's expression softened in that way that always carried an edge. "It does," she said, "especially when family helps each other out." The air in the room shifted, barely, but I felt it. Jordan kept talking about the rehearsal dinner menu, about the guest list, about the beach estate in Cape Cod they'd rented for the big day. The words exclusive venue and private chef floated around like perfume. I smiled, nodded, pretended I wasn't doing the math in my head. A wedding like that easily cost more than a year's salary. When the conversation drifted away from me, I excused myself to the kitchen. The room was quiet there, the hum of the refrigerator steady and low. I filled a glass with water and stood at the counter, letting the cold spread through my palms. A few moments later, I heard the soft shuffle of slippers, and my mother appeared in the doorway, still holding a half-empty cup of tea. "You're awfully quiet," she said. "Everything all right?" "I'm fine," I replied. "Just a lot to take in. The wedding looks extravagant." She smiled faintly. "It should be. Ethan deserves a beautiful start. He's worked hard, you know." I turned to face her. "I'm happy for him." Really? But this can't be cheap. She looked at me for a long second before setting her tea down. Ethan and Jordan have done their part, but there are always little things that come up. Your father and I want to help, of course. Still, these things add up faster than you expect. Her voice was soft, almost motherly, but something in it carried calculation. Then she said it as if it were nothing. I thought maybe you could advance a small amount from your project fund, just temporarily. We'd pay it back as soon as things settle. I stared at her, sure I'd misheard. You want me to use federal grant money? For a wedding? She frowned lightly. It's not as dramatic as that, Maddie. You've always been so good with money. You could move some things around, no one would even notice. It's for family. I set the glass down carefully. That money isn't mine to move. It's for the schools, the programs I'm building. There are audits, regulations. Mom, it's not allowed. She sighed, the sound sharp and practiced. You're always so rigid. You have your career, your apartment, your independence. You're fine. Your brother's just getting started. Sometimes you have to put family first. I swallowed hard. Family doesn't mean breaking the law. Mom, her tone cooled instantly. Don't be ridiculous. It's not breaking the law. It's helping. It's theft, I said quietly, and I won't do it. The silence between us stretched until the clock in the hall ticked loud enough to fill it. She looked down at her cup, then back at me with that smile she used when she wanted to remind me who had raised me. You've never understood what it means to be part of a family, she said. Her words landed clean and sharp. I felt something inside me shift, not anger exactly, but a sudden heavy clarity. Maybe I understand it better than you think. She didn't answer. I left the glass in the sink and walked out of the kitchen. From the living room, I heard Jordan's laughter, the sound of wrapping paper crinkling, the small talk of people planning a perfect life. As I reached for my coat, my father called from his chair. Leaving so soon, honey? Yeah, I said without turning around. I've got some things to finish up. Mom's voice followed me, smooth and controlled. Drive safe, Maddie. The front door closed behind me, the air outside hitting like cold water. I stood for a moment on the porch, the scent of hydrangeas drifting from the garden. The windows glowed softly behind me, my family framed in warm light, smiling oblivious. I walked to my car, started the engine, and sat for a long minute before pulling away. The laughter from inside faded under the hum of the heater. That was the last time I saw them before everything unraveled. I didn't know it yet, but in that kitchen, with her calm voice and that careful smile, my mother had already decided what she was going to do, and I, still trying to be the good daughter, had just given her the silence she needed to go through with it. The morning the call came, the office was quiet, except for the steady rhythm of keyboards. Sunlight bounced off the glass walls of Nova Bridge, making everything look sharper, more fragile. It was just after 10 and I was halfway through an email when my phone buzzed on the desk. The screen flashed the name of someone who never called unless something was wrong. Richard Vaughn, Director of Funding at Future Mind Foundation. I answered, already uneasy. Richard, good morning. His voice was clipped urgent. Maddie, I'm calling because we've detected an unauthorized transfer from your project account. $120,000. Do you know anything about this? My stomach dropped. What? No. That's impossible. The transaction cleared 2 days ago, he said. To an account under the name Thomas Grant. Your records show that's your father, correct? I pressed my hand to my forehead, the office suddenly too bright. He's listed as a co-signer, but he doesn't handle any of the funds. That money was never supposed to be touched. Richard paused, and I could hear the tapping of a keyboard on his end. Maddie, you need to understand the severity of this. If this isn't resolved or explained within 72 hours, Future Mind will have to suspend your grant. And if the funds aren't recovered, we'll be required to report it as a federal violation. The room tilted slightly. The low buzz of conversation outside my office door faded into static. I'll figure it out, I said, forcing my voice steady. You have my word. You'd better, he said softer now. I'm trying to give you the benefit of the doubt, but our compliance team doesn't wait long. The call ended. For a moment, I just sat there, the dial tone still echoing in my ear. My hands were trembling, but not from panic, at least not yet. It was disbelief, cold and deep. I grabbed my coat and walked out of the building without saying a word to anyone. The streets outside shimmered under late morning light, people rushing past with coffee cups and deadlines that didn't matter to me anymore. I drove straight to Lucas Bennett's office on the Charles River. Lucas had been my legal consultant since Nova Bridge's first round of funding, a quiet man, sharp, methodical. The kind of person who made you feel like chaos could be organized if you just followed the right steps. His office was all dark wood and order, the kind of place that smelled faintly of leather and certainty. He looked up when I walked in. "Maddie," he said, standing. "You look like you haven't slept in a week. Sit." I handed him the printed statement from my inbox, the transfer confirmation circled in red. "They took it," I said. "All of it." He read through the papers, his brow tightening. "This is the grant account, yes, the one under Future Mind's oversight. It was supposed to be locked except for operational use." He nodded slowly, flipping to the signature page. "Thomas Grant. That's your father. He's listed as an authorized co-signer." "Did you give him permission for this?" "No, never. He was only supposed to have access for emergencies. Signing papers when I was traveling, nothing more." Lucas leaned back, steepling his fingers. Then he exceeded his authority. "And because it's a federally backed grant that's serious, Future Mind has every right to escalate." I rubbed my temple. "They're threatening to suspend the project in 72 hours. If the funding freezes, my staff won't get paid. The schools we're partnered with, everything stops." He studied me for a long moment. "Maddie, I've seen this before. Family access always complicates things. You're not the first person to trust someone who shouldn't have had that trust. I know," I said quietly, "but I can't let it end like this. Not after everything." He turned to his computer. "We'll file a report with the CFPB today and notify the Massachusetts Division of Financial Institutions. I'll also request that the bank freeze the receiving account until the dispute is resolved. Will that work?" He glanced over his shoulder. "It depends on how fast we move and whether the funds are still there. Once we start the process, there's no going back. You sure you're ready for that?" I nodded. "I'm sure." Lucas printed the initial complaint forms and slid them across the table. "We'll need to include all your records, emails, transaction logs, correspondence with Future Mind. And Maddie," he hesitated, "you'll have to be prepared for your parents to be treated as subjects of investigation." The words landed like stones. Subjects, I repeated the syllables foreign. He met my eyes. They crossed a line. "It's not personal anymore. It's legal." I stared at the pen in my hand. The ink bled slightly onto the paper as I signed. My fingers trembled halfway through the first line, but I forced myself to finish. When I looked up, Lucas was watching me closely. "You did the right thing," he said. I shook my head. "It doesn't feel right." "It rarely does," he said. Then softer. "But when you're quiet and steady, people like that get nervous. They expect shouting. They don't know what to do with silence." Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering brown leaves along the sidewalk, even though summer hadn't ended yet. Through the office window, the Charles River glittered under the sunlight, calm, indifferent, endless. I watched the water for a long moment before saying, "I trusted them." Lucas folded his hands. "Now it's time to trust yourself." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of it settle in my chest. For the first time since the call, I could breathe again, just enough to take the next step. Rain had followed me all the way from Cambridge to my parents' house, streaking the windshield and blurring the neat rows of maple trees along the quiet suburban street. By the time I parked in front of their house, the sky had turned a solid slab of gray. I sat there for a full minute watching water gather on the hood of my car, breathing in and out, until the anger settled into something colder, steadier. The folder in the passenger seat, bank records, emails, signed authorizations, felt heavier than paper should. When I rang the doorbell, my mother answered right away as if she had been expecting me. She looked tired, but composed, wearing one of her cream-colored sweaters and pearls, her version of calm before a storm. The smell of fresh flowers drifted from the dining room. "Maddie," she said softly, her tone somewhere between surprise and annoyance. "What a day to be out. Come in before you catch cold." I stepped inside. The living room looked like a florist's shop exploded. Bouquets everywhere. Roses, lilies, hydrangeas. She had arranged them by color, just like she used to organize her charity gala tables. My father sat in his usual armchair reading the paper, pretending not to notice me. I walked past her and placed the folder squarely on the coffee table. "Mom," I said, "I'm only going to ask once. Why?" She blinked, genuinely puzzled, or pretending to be. "Why what, dear?" I pointed to the folder. "The money, all of it. Why did you take it?" She gave a small, tired laugh, the kind that always made me feel like a child overreacting. "Oh, Maddie, we didn't take it. We borrowed it. You'll get it back after the wedding. You borrowed a federal grant." I said, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. You realize what that means? It's not just my name on that account. It's the U.S. Department of Education's oversight. My father finally lowered his paper, folding it neatly on his lap. Don't be dramatic, he said. It's family money. You worked hard, yes, but everything you've done started with our help. The least you can do is help your brother when he needs it. I looked from one to the other, disbelief hardening into something like grief. Help doesn't mean stealing Dad, and it doesn't mean putting me at risk of losing everything I built. Mom set down her tea. You're always so rigid. You think the world will end because of a few transactions. Ethan's wedding is important. People will be there. Friends, colleagues, donors. He can't look like he's struggling. It reflects on the whole family. It's not the family's reputation I'm worried about, I said. It's the law. The air between us thickened. Outside, rain tapped against the window in slow, uneven beats. My father sighed like he'd been patient long enough. We raised you to value loyalty. Family helps family, no questions asked. That's how this works. Then maybe you raised me wrong, I said quietly. For a moment, no one spoke. The clock on the mantel ticked a low, steady reminder of how far we'd drifted from each other. My mother's face hardened. Her voice lost its warmth. You've always been different. Cold. Ungrateful, even. Ethan has a good heart. He gives without keeping score, because he's always been given everything I snapped. He doesn't know what it means to earn something. Her jaw tightened. Enough! I reached for the folder and opened it. The transaction forms, the transfer confirmation, the authorization logs, all lined up in black and white. I slid them across the table. Look, these are your signatures. There's no misunderstanding here. Mom barely glanced at them. It was only supposed to be temporary. We would have paid it back once the house sold. Do you even hear yourself, I said. That's fraud, Mom. There are rules. You can't just rewrite them when it's convenient. My father stood, his tone suddenly firm. Watch your mouth. You don't talk to your mother that way. I turned toward him. Then maybe you should have told her no. He didn't answer. He just stared at me, and I could see the shame flicker behind his anger. For a second, I almost pitied him. Mom's voice broke the silence again, quieter this time, but sharper. You'll regret this attitude one day. You think success makes you better than us, but you'll see. Family is the only thing that stays. Not when you use it as an excuse, I said. Not when you twist it to get what you want. The room went still. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. The rain had turned heavier, sliding down the fogged windows like veins of silver. I gathered the papers back into the folder and stood. My mother's eyes followed me, unblinking. Where are you going? She asked. Home, I said. Someplace where my name still means something. Her voice trailed after me as I walked to the door. One day, you'll realize how much we've done for you, and you'll wish you'd handled this differently. I opened the door. Cold air rushed in the scent of wet asphalt, sharp and clean. I looked back just once. No, Mom, I said. This time it's you who'll regret it. The screen door shut behind me. Rain splattered my shoes as I walked to the car. My hands were steady when I started the engine, but my chest ached in that deep, dull way that comes after truth finally surfaces. As I pulled away, the house faded into the blur of gray and rain. I could still see her standing there in the window, a silhouette framed by flowers and flickering light, arranging something that was already falling apart. 2 days later, I walked into the Nova Bridge office and felt the shift in the air before I even saw the looks. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups froze halfway to mouths. It wasn't loud. The opposite, actually. The kind of quiet that tells you everyone already knows something you don't want them to. Olivia Hart was waiting by the conference room door, her face pale beneath her usual bright lipstick. She grabbed my arm the second I passed her. Maddie, she whispered, don't go in there yet. What's going on? Her eyes darted toward the glass wall. Inside, a few board members huddled around the table, whispering. Future Mind's investigating, she said quietly. They think you pulled the funds yourself. Someone leaked it to the press. For a moment, everything around me blurred. The office chatter, the glow of monitors, the faint hum of the air conditioning. That's impossible, I said. They have every transaction record, every audit log. Olivia shook her head. Doesn't matter. The headline's already out. They're calling it grant fraud at Nova Bridge. Someone tipped off the education blog, and now it's spreading. It's on Twitter, LinkedIn, everywhere. I tried to steady my breathing, but my chest tightened anyway. When I looked up, a few interns were watching me from their desks, eyes wide with curiosity and pity. In the elevator, I caught my reflection in the stainless steel wall. Pale face, tired eyes, hair slightly out of place. I didn't look guilty, but I didn't look innocent either. Just drained. When your reputation starts to collapse, it doesn't make a sound at first. It just quietly folds in on itself until all that's left is the echo of what people think they know. When I reached the 5th floor, my phone buzzed again. Another email from Future Mind marked urgent. Mandatory compliance meeting. 1:00 p.m. By noon, the story had spread. My assistant came into my office, holding her phone awkwardly. "Maddie, there's something online you should see." She showed me a post, an anonymous comment thread about a female founder who misused federal education funds. I didn't need to read further. The comments blurred together anyway. People speculating, accusing, dissecting. At 1:01 sharp, I joined the emergency meeting. The boardroom felt colder than usual, the blinds half drawn against a dull gray sky. On the big screen, Richard Vaughn's face appeared from his office in New York. His expression was calm, controlled, professional. The kind that meant he'd already made up his mind. "Maddie," he began. "We've launched an internal review following the unauthorized transfer. Until the investigation concludes, Future Mind is temporarily suspending all financial activity related to Nova Bridge." I forced myself to stay composed. "Richard, I've already filed a complaint through my attorney. The funds were withdrawn without my consent." "I understand that's your claim," he said carefully. "But until we see verified evidence, we can't make exceptions. I'm sure you understand the optics." Olivia, sitting beside me, leaned toward the camera. "She didn't do this. You know her track record, Richard. She's transparent to a fault." Richard sighed. "I know this is difficult, but I have to follow procedure. The account access will be frozen effective immediately." He clicked off. Just like that, the line went dead, and the only sound left was the hum of the projector cooling down. No one said a word. Olivia touched my arm, but I stood before she could speak. "It's fine," I said, even though it wasn't. "Let them finish the investigation." I walked out of the conference room, the hallway stretching endlessly ahead. My coworkers pretended to be busy as I passed. I could feel their glances flicker up and away the way people look at a car crash they're ashamed to watch. By the time I reached my office, the city outside had disappeared under a foggy mist. Boston in October could look so peaceful it hurt. I stood by the window watching the Charles River blur into silver. My phone rang again. "Lucas, don't respond publicly," he said before I could even say hello. "Not to the press, not online. Let them speculate. Silence will work in your favor." "They've frozen the project," I said. "Future Mind pulled everything." "I know. I've been on the phone with the bank. The receiving account, your parents, has been flagged and locked pending investigation. That's our first win." It took me a second to process the words. "They froze it temporarily, yes. It buys us time." I leaned against the window frame, feeling the smallest breath of relief in what had felt like an endless drop. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the skyline. For the first time in days, I let myself breathe. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was proof that maybe the truth was starting to shift back toward me inch by inch. When I hung up, I didn't move for a while. The office lights flickered on behind me as evening crept in. My name would keep circulating online, the whispers wouldn't stop overnight, but somewhere out there, a small piece of what was taken from me had finally been locked away from them. And for now, that was enough. The rain had turned steady by the time I reached Lucas Bennett's office again. The kind that didn't crash or pour, just whispered against the windows like it had something to say, but was too polite to interrupt. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, the hum of a small desk lamp casting a warm glow across the walnut table. I stood by the door for a moment, shaking off my umbrella before Lucas looked up from his paperwork. "She's here," he said. A woman stepped out from the adjoining conference room. A dark coat hair pulled back, expression sharp and unhurried. She extended her hand. "Karen O'Neill, Financial Crimes Division, Commonwealth of Massachusetts." Her handshake was firm, professional. She sat across from me, setting down a leather folder that looked like it had been carried through a dozen similar cases. "Ms. Grant," she began, her voice even, "we've completed the first phase of our digital trace. The IP address used to authorize the transfer was logged from a private residence in Cambridge." My stomach tightened. "Which residence?" She opened the folder, sliding a printed log across the table. Your parents' address. Lucas leaned forward, flipping through the sheets. The screen of his laptop glowed as he connected to the state database, projecting a digital map on the wall. This is the timeline of access, he said, pointing to the timestamps. The login originated from a personal device registered under Elaine Grant. The same device accessed your Future Mind correspondence 3 days prior. The blue dots on the screen blinked softly, marking each digital footprint. My mother's name stared back at me in rows of numbers and data, a language of betrayal that didn't lie. Karen folded her hands. We also matched the device's fingerprint to previous banking activity tied to her personal account. The overlap is conclusive. There's no sign of external tampering or remote interference. I looked at the data again, silent. It wasn't anger anymore. Just a dull clarity, heavy but clean like air after thunder. I don't feel happy, I said quietly. Just lighter. Karen's gaze softened slightly. Understandable. Closure rarely feels good. It just makes room for the truth. Lucas nodded. We've filed the formal motion with the U.S. District Court. Since it involves federal education funds, it escalates automatically to joint jurisdiction. State and federal. Karen adjusted the papers in her folder. A temporary freeze is already in effect. Within 72 hours, officers will execute a warrant to secure evidence from the Grant residence. The words hung in the air. I stared at the condensation gathering on the window behind her. Should I be there? Lucas shook his head. No, that's not your part anymore. Let the system speak for you. I exhaled a sound between relief and disbelief. They'll hate me for this. Karen closed her folder and stood her tone gentler now. They'll hate what they did to themselves eventually. She buttoned her coat. One last thing, Grant. Justice comes, but not always warm. It tends to knock on the coldest mornings. She offered a small nod to Lucas, then left her footsteps fading down the hallway, until only the rain was left. I stayed where I was, watching the reflection of the streetlights ripple in the glass. The city outside looked blurred, distant, almost forgiving. Lucas broke the silence. You did everything right. I didn't answer. My hands rested on the table, palms open, the papers between them no longer felt like weapons, just proof. Outside, a car passed its headlights, cutting briefly across the window before disappearing into the wet street. I turned to Lucas. It's strange, I said. The more truth surfaces, the quieter it gets inside me. He smiled faintly. That's what peace sounds like. I nodded, though I wasn't sure it was peace. Maybe it was just the space left after everything else had been stripped away. When I finally stood to leave, the rain had eased into a fine mist. I paused at the door, looking once more at the screen still glowing faintly behind us. The pinpoint of Cambridge on the digital map. That small, blinking light where everything had begun, and where soon it would all come undone. The sun was merciless that afternoon, bright and golden over Cape Cod. The ocean shimmered like glass behind the rows of white chairs lined neatly across the sand. Pale blue ribbons fluttered in the breeze. A string quartet played something soft and expensive. From far away, it looked perfect, the kind of wedding people wrote about in lifestyle magazines. I wasn't there, but I could see it in my mind as clearly as if I'd been standing on the shore. Ethan in his tailored suit, grinning that practiced grin. Jordan radiant in her satin gown, the wind tugging at her veil. My mother flawless as always in sea-green chiffon, fussing with centerpieces and schedules. My father standing beside her, the picture of control. The photographer called out. Directions, guests laughed. Champagne glasses clinked. Everything gleamed, until it didn't. Elaine glanced at her phone, frowning. She tapped the screen again, her manicured finger hovering over the banking app. That's strange, she murmured. The venue payment hasn't cleared yet. The wedding planner. A young woman with a headset and perfect posture appeared at her side. Mrs. Grant, she said softly. I'm afraid we have an issue. The final transfer for the venue was reversed this morning. My mother blinked. Reversed? What do you mean, reversed? The bank said the funds were frozen under a federal hold. The planner whispered. They mentioned an ongoing investigation connected to the originating account. Color drained from my mother's face. Her voice thinned. That can't be right. It must be a mistake. Run it again. I already did. The planner said, eyes flicking nervously toward the crowd. I'm sorry, ma'am, but it's not processing. Ethan noticed the tension and hurried over, smile fading. Mom. What's going on? Nothing. Elaine snapped, lowering her voice. Go back to your guests. The planner hesitated, her professionalism slipping. Mrs. Grant, I have to be transparent. Without confirmation, we can't proceed with the ceremony. Nearby, 2 guests whispered, "Did you hear something about payment issues?" Another voice chimed in, half amused, half scandalized. You'd think they'd have this covered, all that talk about the family's success. Jordan, mid-pose for a photo, caught the murmurs. She turned, confusion creasing her perfect expression. "What's happening?" Ethan reached for her hand. "It's fine. Just a glitch. Mom's handling it." Her smile faltered. A glitch. She looked toward the planner. "Is everything paid for or not?" The planner swallowed hard. "Not yet, ma'am." Jordan's voice rose just enough to carry. "You told me everything was under control." "Ethan?" He stammered, glancing at his mother. "She said it was a legal transfer. I didn't know there was an issue." Elaine's composure cracked. "Stop talking," she hissed. "Do not make a scene." But it was already too late. The guests had gone silent. The music faltered. The only sound left was the ocean, calm and cruel in its indifference. The planner adjusted her mic, voice trembling, as she addressed the small crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a brief delay. Please remain seated while we verify final arrangements." Jordan pulled her hand away from Ethan's. The look she gave him wasn't angry so much as hollow. "You lied to me," she said quietly. She slipped off her engagement ring and pressed it into his palm. "Enjoy your perfect day." Then she turned, lifted her skirt, and walked straight down the aisle, past the flowers, past the cameras, past everything that had been bought with my stolen trust. Ethan stood frozen, staring after her. Around him, whispers rose like static. "She's leaving. Is this real? Did they not pay the venue?" My father looked away, jaw tight, unable, or unwilling, to stop it. My mother's voice broke. "Jordan, wait, please," but the bride didn't turn back. The planner's assistant approached with an apologetic whisper. "We'll have to suspend the event until payment clears." The microphone clicked again, her voice small but steady through the speakers. "I'm sorry, everyone. The ceremony is postponed until further notice." No one applauded. No one moved. Ethan sat down hard in the nearest chair, shoulders collapsing. My mother swayed, clutching her phone like it might reverse the world if she just pressed the right button. My father stepped away, hands buried in his pockets, staring out at the horizon, as if he'd finally seen what pride had cost them. The wind rose off the water, scattering white petals across the sand. The sound of waves drowned out the murmurs. From miles away, I imagined the scene exactly as it unfolded. The flowers unraveling the music, dying the golden boy's perfect life, collapsing under the weight of one reversed transaction. That day wasn't my victory. It was their lesson. And the sea, indifferent as ever, carried the sound of it away. The morning broke gray and cold over Cambridge. The kind of air that made every sound feel sharper. Wind chased dry leaves along the sidewalk, spinning them into small, nervous circles before they disappeared down the gutters. At precisely 8:30, the front door of my parents' house opened. Elaine stood there in her robe, her hand still gripping the brass handle like she could keep the day from coming in. On the porch below Detective Karen O'Neill, 2 uniformed officers and Lucas Bennett waited. Karen's coat was buttoned to the collar, her tone even but unmistakably official. "Elaine Grant, Thomas Grant," she said, unfolding a set of documents. "You're being served with a federal subpoena regarding the unlawful use and transfer of educational grant funds. You are not under arrest at this time, but you are required to comply fully with the investigation." My mother didn't speak. Her eyes flickered from the badge to the papers, then back to Karen. Her knuckles whitened against the doorframe. Behind her, my father appeared, hair uncombed, face ashen. He'd aged 10 years in 3 days. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice brittle. "We already fixed the mistake. The money's been returned." Lucas stepped forward, his briefcase in hand. His tone was calm, almost kind. "That's true. The funds have been restored to the Nova Bridge account. But it doesn't erase the act, Mr. Grant. The investigation still proceeds." Ethan stood further back in the hallway, still in the same suit he'd worn at the wedding that never happened. His eyes darted between them, unfocused. "This can't be happening," he muttered. "It was supposed to be temporary." Elaine finally found her voice, though it trembled. "You can't just show up here like this. We're not criminals." Karen's expression didn't change. "That's not for me to decide, ma'am. This is standard procedure." She handed the documents over. "You'll need to appear at the district court next Monday at 9. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind lifted a few strands of my mother's hair across her face. Her hand shook as she took the papers. Thomas's lips parted as if to argue, but no words came out. From the street, the low hum of a police cruiser idling filled the silence. It wasn't loud, but it made the quiet heavier. Lucas looked up toward the window on the second floor, where sheer curtains swayed slightly. "It's better to cooperate," he said softly. "The faster we clarify this, the faster it's over." Karen gave one final nod. "We'll be in touch." She turned, stepping off the porch, her boots splashing lightly in the puddles that had formed along the walkway. The officers followed their radios, crackling faintly as they returned to the car. Elaine stood frozen in the doorway, eyes glassy. Thomas stepped behind her, his hand landing awkwardly on her shoulder, unsure whether it was for comfort or stability. The front door stayed open long after the officers left, letting the cold air creep into the hall. Across town in my apartment overlooking the Charles, the world felt completely different. The light was soft and pale, breaking gently through the clouds. My phone buzzed on the table. A new message from Future Mind Funds Restored. Account reactivated. I stared at it for a long time. Not smiling, not crying, just breathing. The notification felt like a full stop at the end of a long, painful sentence. I carried my coffee to the window and sat down, pulling my knees up on the chair. The city outside looked washed clean after the storm steam rising faintly from the streets. 3 days. That's how long it took for truth to arrive. Not loud, not violent, just steady. Through the glass, I could almost see their house across the city, the one I'd left behind. The image of that open door, the officers standing there, Karen's measured tone, Lucas's calm professionalism. All of it played quietly in my mind like a film I hadn't chosen to watch, but needed to see. They'd learn now, I thought, not through my words, but through consequence. The phone buzzed again, Lucas this time. "It's done," his text read. They cooperated. The warrant was served without incident. Karen's exact words, "Justice isn't fast, but it's accurate." I placed the phone face down on the table, the message still glowing faintly beneath the glass. Outside, the sun broke through for the first time in days, lighting up the edge of the river. The water shimmered gold. I leaned my head back against the chair and closed my eyes. For once, I didn't need to say anything. The silence said enough. Across the city, the Grants' house grew quiet again. The cruiser pulled away from the curb, its red and blue lights fading into the gray morning. The curtains at the front window stirred in the breeze before falling, still hiding everything behind them once more. A week later, the city woke to headlines that carried my family's name. On the morning news between weather updates and stock reports, the anchor's voice was steady, professional. The Grant family of Cambridge is under investigation following allegations of misappropriating federal education funds. Authorities confirm the funds have been returned, but the inquiry remains ongoing. I watched from my kitchen, the steam from my coffee fogging the edge of the television screen. They used an old photo, my parents at a charity gala, smiling my father's arm around my mother's shoulder. The caption beneath it read, "Local Family Faces Federal Scrutiny." Outside, the world went on, as usual. A jogger past a mail truck groaned down the street. But inside that house on the screen, silence had finally taken root. By noon, social media picked it up. Ethan's real estate firm released a statement. Effective immediately, Mr. Ethan Grant is no longer affiliated with the company. His face, once on every promotional billboard downtown, disappeared from their website within hours. Then came Jordan's post. Simple white text on a black background. Sometimes silence says everything. It went viral for all the wrong reasons. That afternoon, my mother went to the local market as she did every Friday for years. People looked up as she walked in, then quickly looked away. The cashier who always greeted her pretended to rearrange the fruit display. 2 women near the bakery whispered not as quietly as they thought. "That's her, the one who stole from her daughter." My mother didn't say a word. She bought a loaf of bread handed over cash and left without waiting for change. I wasn't there, but I could imagine it perfectly. The way she kept her chin up, her hand trembling only after she reached the car. Justice isn't about punishment. It's about ending the lie. Later that week, my father packed a suitcase. I didn't know until an envelope arrived at my door. Plain white, my name written in his careful script. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Maddie, I'm sorry for standing silent when I should have spoken. I told myself I was protecting the family, but all I did was let it fall apart. I hope you'll understand one day that silence can be its own kind of cowardice." I read it twice, then folded it neatly. and placed it back in the envelope. I felt no anger, no triumph, just the quiet ache of something finally finished. That evening I met Olivia at a small cafe by the river, the same place we used to go after late nights at the office. She waved when she saw me, her smile tentative. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. "I wasn't sure either." I admitted sliding into the chair across from her. She stirred her coffee eyes down. "I owe you an apology. When the investigation started, I didn't know what to believe. I thought maybe you'd crossed a line trying to keep the project afloat." I smiled faintly. "You don't have to explain." "No," she said, meeting my eyes. I should have trusted you." "It's okay," I said, after a moment. I doubted myself, too. The wind coming off the Charles was cold that evening, carrying the faint smell of rain. We sat for a while without speaking, watching the water move, slow, steady, certain. When I got home, I opened my laptop. A new email blinked in the inbox Future Mind Foundation. Project reinstatement. The message was short. "Ms. Grant, the Nova Bridge Initiative has been restored to full standing. We apologize for the misunderstanding and appreciate your cooperation during the investigation. Thank you for your continued commitment to educational equity." At the bottom, Richard Vaughn's signature gleamed formal and impersonal. But I didn't need warmth from him. The words were enough. Grant restored. I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and looked toward the window. The lights of Boston shimmered on the river like fractured glass, broken pieces still beautiful. No one wins in stories like these. There's only balance returned quietly to where it belongs. The morning light in Malibu had a softness that didn't exist anywhere else. It spilled over the ocean in gold ribbons, touched the palms. The terrace, the white linen curtains that swayed with every breeze. The air smelled like salt and coffee. I sat on the balcony of my villa at Ocean Crest Resort, a mug warm between my hands, the steady crash of waves filling the quiet. A folded newspaper lay on the table beside me, creased from the wind. The headline caught my eye. "Elaine Grant resigns from Cambridge Women's Philanthropy Council. Beneath it, a smaller line, Ethan Grant relocates to Colorado." Following business setback. I traced the ink absently, not out of satisfaction, just to feel something solid under my fingertips. The world had moved on. So had I. Footsteps sounded softly behind me. Marcus Lee appeared at the edge of the terrace, his hands tucked into his pockets. His usual calm smile on his face. "Morning, Miss Grant. I saw your name in the paper again." I smiled faintly. "I guess some stories take longer to end." He nodded toward the view. "How does it feel?" "Everything over. Everything quiet." I took a sip of coffee before answering. Like breathing after a long swim. "No one wins, Marcus. I just stopped losing." He studied me for a moment as if trying to decide whether that was peace or resignation. Then he gestured toward the sand. "The tide's low. Perfect walk before the afternoon heat." We walked along the shoreline, the surf brushing at our ankles. The sky was painted with streaks of coral and gold, the kind of light that made even memory seem softer. The air was warm enough that it felt like forgiveness. I said, "You know, people talk about karma like it's punishment, but it's not. It's balance. The world just finds its way back to even." Marcus nodded. "Then you must be standing right in the middle of it." Maybe I said, or maybe I just stopped standing in the way. He laughed quietly, then let the silence take over. We walked until the sun sank halfway into the ocean, until the shadows lengthened behind us. When I returned to the villa, the room was glowing with late afternoon light. A soft knock sounded at the door. One of the resort staff stood outside holding a cream envelope. "For you, Miss Grant. It was delivered from Boston this morning. Handwritten." "Thank you," I said, taking it. The paper was thick, the handwriting on the front unmistakably my mother's. For a long time I didn't move. Finally, I sat down at the desk by the window and broke the seal. "Maddie," it began, "I was wrong. For years I confused control with care. I told myself I was protecting you, but I was really protecting my pride. I thought love meant guiding you, but what I really did was hold you back. I see that now. I see what I cost you. Your peace, your trust, maybe even your family. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope one day you'll believe that I loved you even if I didn't know how to show it." The handwriting faltered near the end. I miss you every day. The house feels empty. Your father's gone quiet. Ethan doesn't call. Maybe that's my punishment. I'm learning what silence really means. I hope, wherever you are, you've found peace. Love, Mom. I read it twice. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, not from anger, but from the weight of something breaking and finally being released. The light shifted across the desk, brushing the edge of the letter like forgiveness itself. I folded the page carefully, smoothed the crease with my palm, and slipped it into my bag. Then I stepped out onto the balcony again. The ocean stretched out before me, endless and forgiving. The horizon burned gold as the sun sank lower. The air tasted of salt and something sweet I couldn't name. I forgive you. I whispered, not to the letter, not even to her, but to the part of myself that had been waiting to say it. The waves rolled in steady and soft. I closed my eyes. I had forgiven, but I wasn't going back. The wind lifted my hair, and the sound of the sea folded around me like a heartbeat, constant calm, eternal calm. A year later, Boston felt different, not smaller, not softer, just clearer. The air carried that early autumn crispness sharp enough to wake you without a second cup of coffee. The glass atrium of the Boston Leadership Forum gleamed under warm light banners lining the stage, boundaries and trust in leadership. The irony wasn't lost on me. I stood backstage, straightening my white blouse, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. The crowd murmured beyond the curtain, executives, educators, a few journalists. The moderator's voice came through the mic. Our next speaker, Maddie Grant, founder of the Nova Bridge Initiative, will share a personal story about resilience and integrity. Applause rippled. My pulse steadied as I stepped into the light. The stage was bathed in amber. In the front row, Olivia smiled, phone resting idle in her lap. Beside her sat Lucas Bennett, hands folded, his expression proud but unreadable. 2 seats down, Richard Vaughn from Future Mind nodded politely. I adjusted the mic. A few years ago, I learned that silence isn't weakness. It's not surrender either. Sometimes it's the only language truth understands. The room stilled. I used to think that setting boundaries made me difficult, that saying no made me ungrateful. And when the people closest to me crossed those boundaries, I thought staying quiet was noble. But silence, I said, pausing, can also be the last stage of denial. A woman in the second row wiped her eyes. I didn't need to look at Olivia to know she was holding her breath. I won't give you the details. I continued, but let's just say I learned what betrayal costs, and what it gives back when you stop running from it. I thought I lost everything, but what I really did was trade noise for peace. The screen behind me shifted, displaying one of Nova Bridge's community programs, a classroom of children holding tablets laughing. This, I said softly, is what happens when you protect what matters, instead of defending what doesn't. The applause came slowly at first, then built until it filled the hall. I stepped back, smiling, not from pride, but from something gentler, closure. As the lights dimmed, I spotted Lucas giving me a small nod, the kind that said everything was where it should be. Later, I slipped out through the side doors and walked toward the Charles River. The city glowed in the sunset, gold reflected on the water wind carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. I leaned against the railing, watching the current move. Slow, deliberate, unstoppable. Somewhere across town, my mother was probably sitting by her window, that same light spilling through her curtains. I imagined her holding a copy of the letter she'd written, maybe reading it again this time without shame, just quiet acceptance. I didn't need to know for sure. Some stories didn't need witnesses to end, said her. The water caught the light like silver. I breathed in the cool air. There are wounds that never heal because they don't have to. They just remind you where you stopped bleeding. I started walking, heels clicking softly against the cobblestone path. The city fading into the hum of evening traffic. The wind off the river brushed my face, warm and clean. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, remember this silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's how justice learns to speak. And when it finally does, you'll know, because peace will sound exactly like your own breath.